Greetings, folks. My name is Dustin Cormier. This is an episode of How to Rock Astrology. And today I'd like to ask you, where are you in the evolutionary script of life's perennial stages? Perennial as relating to a plant. Just as plants have a scripted seed and bloom time, so do humans also have our own evolutionary script. And this is an evolutionary script I'll be talking with you about today. This is a merger of evolutionary Western astrology and Vedic astrology. I've broken down life's major transits and arcs into 4 evolutionary arcs. And we can see 3 of them here, as well as the 4th being the Saturn transits. Now, we're going to go through them as we come along, but I want to begin this video showing all of them combined together. And this is what I call our evolutionary script, or our evolutionary calendar. Feel free to pause this, take a screenshot, and then this would be part 2 from 50 years old onward. So feel free to pause this, take a picture of it. It might seem like a lot and it's confusing, but we're going to go through them all today, and we're going to make a little bit of sense of what we're seeing happening in each of these little pockets. As you all know, I'm a tropical Vedic astrologer. I use Western measurements with tropical astrology, but I apply Vedic jyotish styles of interpretation. I'm sort of neo-Vedic, I suppose you could say, because my roots are in Western astrology. And so thus, like many Western astrologers, I put a large emphasis, of course, on Saturn transits. And this is, Saturn transits, of course, happen, Saturn has a set pace that it goes around the chart. So there's a general timeline where Saturn is going to be moving through certain aspects of each person's chart. Now, these numbers that we see are ages. For example, 0 to 2, Saturn is at its natal point and its natal sign. Then 28 years later, because Saturn takes about 28 years to go around the zodiac, Saturn returns to its natal spot. It's the same thing around the age of 58, 59, around that area. So Saturn's transits are one evolutionary arc. Of course, the transiting nodes is also a key arc. And I'm going to go a little bit more into the nodes in another video, because the node transits are very important. There's a lot to talk about there. I've put these maturations in here as well, but really these belong in the graha maturation. So this is the 3rd arc, where we see at a certain number of years, at a certain age, each planet matures. And you'll note that it's this column on the right, from Mars onward, that is the most significant, really. And finally, we have what is called the Naisargika Dasha, the graha periods. And you've seen me talk about these when I do my cold readings. And so we're going to go a little bit more into them today. So these are 4 major evolutionary arcs that are all combined in this evolutionary calendar that I'm very glad to be sharing with you all. So it looks like a whole lot of colorful rainbow French in all sorts of languages. We're going to bring it all together now, ladies and gentlemen. Now, we could discuss a little bit about everything, but my plan is to do this almost like I used to do with my Asheville Vedic astrology essays. I've got my notes, and we're just going to run our way into each of these 4 evolutionary arcs and see how they all combine in the end. So let me know if you have questions. Feel free to put some comments. I hope that this is a worthwhile expenditure of your time. I think if you give it a moment, you'll find that it is. This is a useful script for everybody to see where they are in these evolutionary stages that are like a neurological script. Humanity everybody at a certain age is going to be experiencing this unfolding script in the same way. But of course, each unfolding element of the script is going to be particular to where the planet or the house or the signs ruled by a planet are in your own chart. We all experience the stages in the same way. Or rather, we all experience the same stages, but we all experience each stage relative to our own natal placement of the elements involved. So once we break it all down, I think you guys will see that it's easy to understand. So let's start moving. First, obviously, this is the one that most Westerners are going to know about. This is the transits of Saturn. And of course, this picture, I've blown up the letters and the numbers a little bit, but this is a picture that was originally published in the Mountain Astrologer, October-December 2021. Much has been made of Saturn's transits for good reason, especially in the West. Now, I'd like to explain a little bit here. This is true of Saturn transits especially. I really would say that this, in some ways, relates to all these evolutionary arcs, but most particularly to Saturn, okay? Now, Saturn's transits, because Saturn is a planet of excretion. It's shitting, pissing, puking. Sorry if you're new to my channel and you're hearing me use these words, but Saturn is, I got a lot of Saturn in my chart, and it's visceral like this. Saturn rules excrement, and it's exalted in Libra, which rules the kidneys and sort of has similar functions. Now, when I'm counseling somebody on a Saturn transit, especially Sadhisati, definitely keep your eyes out for Sadhisati in your chart. That's when Saturn goes over the moon. But when Saturn goes over anything in the chart, I will counsel a person about this, and I'll ask them, why is it that we go to the bathroom? Is it because Saturn is at the noon position above us in the sky? Oh, Saturn's above me, now it's time to go to the bathroom. No. It's because we haven't gone to the bathroom in however many hours and however much time. So, similarly with Saturn transiting a natal point, a natal house, a natal sign, our soul has not gone to the bathroom regarding that point in 28 years. And as well, even Saturn hitting its square to certain points and hitting its opposition to certain points especially, is going to be a small excretion, a small going to the bathroom, so to speak. Saturn in its transits through this excreting process, it's like a uterine shedding. It's a period. It's a releasing of what no longer serves. It brings maturity and growth, often through difficulty, due to our not having smartened up in that place where Saturn is transiting. And the reason we haven't smartened up there is because we just haven't looked deeply at that place for a long time, because Saturn has been looking more deeply at other points. Now it finally creeps up, and Saturn visits that point, and all of a sudden we get smacked around and realize how little we've been paying attention to that thing, right? So the most significant things in the Saturn cycle, of course it does have its own quadrants in a way, but these are Saturn's transits to its own natal point. So we can see this is as if it's a chart, and Saturn represents the rising sign in this particular chart. It goes from the first to the second, third, fourth from itself, and that's when it's the first square. Then it goes to the fifth and sixth and seventh from itself. That's the opposition, etc., all the way around. Returns and oppositions are the most intensely felt. And if you want to know a bit more about Saturn transits and about Sadhisati in particular, check out my Sadhisati video, and as well I have a whole series on the Saturn transits as Saturn moves around through the houses of the chart. Now that is one of our evolutionary arcs. Next up we have what's called Naisargika Dasha. These are natural planetary periods of life. Now, of course, this is a dasha, and you guys have probably heard about what we call the mahadashas. The mahadashas, or mahadashas, are an aspect of what is called vimshotari, and this is an internal clock that is always revolving, and this is its own evolutionary script that goes off in a mechanically precise fashion. Dashas are like this. The mahadashas are something that each individual person has that's not a part of this script, this evolutionary script. But what we're talking about here today is something that happens at the same age for everybody. They flower in the way that regular dashas do in terms of their effects coming through our planets in the chart, the signs, houses, yogas, etc. So from 0 to 1, you're going to experience an emphasis of whatever is going on with the moon and Cancer in your chart. And it's going to lay a very strong brickwork for how your unconscious operates in reaction to the world around you. If you've got bad afflictions happening in the sign of Cancer, or if you've got some bad afflictions happening to the moon, if your moon is weak in Shadbala, if it's got bad, ugly yogas happening, then it's likely that something beyond your control is going to happen from 0 to 1 years old that's going to reflect a very deep cornerstone of your unconscious reaction to the world. Moving on, then we have Mars would be next from 1 to 3. This is the teething period where we experience, we're going through the terrible twos, our motor functions are coming into order, and we're learning how to get what we want through yelling, through signaling, through emergency. Mercury is next from 3 to 12. This is where we are learning. Now, all of this stuff comes from, in particular, really, it comes from Parashara. As well, I think that we're probably going to describe at some point, if I don't already have it in here. I guess I do not. This comes from, gosh, I gotta get the name of it now. It's worth it too because I've got it here. Spoojidvajas Yavanajaptika. So Spoojidvaja is one of the old Vedic jyotish writers. That's one of the oldest books that talks about this part of the evolutionary script. Parashara, in his Brihat Parashara Horashastra, also talks about it, and Ernst Wilhelm does a great translation of what is found there in his Graha Sutras. I highly recommend it. It's one of my great texts from my teacher, Ernst Wilhelm. So as we can see that just like everybody goes through this infantile phase, where all you can do is receive the breast, everybody goes through these terrible twos, where all we can do is learn how to use our motor functions. Everybody goes through the learning phase, which is a prepubescent friendship mercurial phase, learning who you are and what you are prior to the sexual agitation period of Venus. And then, of course, we enter the Venus period from 12 to 32. It's technically not necessarily the longest period, but this Venus period of 20 years is a period, it's what we call Venus o'clock in the soul. And we could say that about all of these Naisargika Dasha periods. It's Venus o'clock. So from 12 to 32, you're making a deep impression of the things going on with Venus and Taurus and Libra inside of your chart. If there are afflictions to Venus, then you're going to experience difficulties related to the affliction on Venus. And as well, if Venus also is afflicting other planets. If you have Jupiter, who is starved by Venus, or the Sun is also starved by Venus. If you have Jupiter or the Sun in Taurus or Libra, then this Venus period is going to be starving your spirit somehow. And of course, this is also going to, if you've got the Sun in Taurus, you're going to experience things in the Venus Dasha, which is actually also going to obstruct you when you get to the Sun Dasha. Because all of the planets have their hand in the present moment. This is something I always like to say. You build as you go. You know, if you get married at age 24, you're in the Venus period for your marriage. And if Jupiter has, you know, your Jupiter has its hand in that marriage. Even though you got married for Venus reasons, your Jupiter enjoyment is going to unfold at 32, and that'll be a different dimension of your marriage. I digress. When you are in the Venus period, just like any dasha, from 12 to 32, everybody experiences what Venus is in their chart. And this affects what happens to you from 12 to 32. Venus o'clock in the soul is a period of intimacy and passion. Young love, learning how to enjoy Venus like the soles of our shoes, or it's water on our journey up the mountain. It's learning how to regenerate ourselves, learning how to enjoy, you know, for men, it's finding, in this period, we learn about finding an enjoyable wife. And for women, the women will learn how to be an enjoyable wife. And of course, these have permutations for people who are bisexual, who are homosexual, or who identify transgender. I haven't worked any of that out in my brain, but it's, you know, it's likely, for example, a gay man would probably find more about their partner in the Jupiter period, and a lesbian woman might find more about her partner in the Venus period. A man who identifies as a woman is going to find more about their lover in the Jupiter period. Because women are attracted to Jupiter and men are attracted to Venus, right? I hope that's clear. So there's Venus o'clock, and then from 32 to the age of 50, we have what's called the Jupiter period. It's Jupiter o'clock in the soul. And this is a phase focused on joyfully fulfilling one's duties. I just recently did a nice little video on Jupiter is true love, and it explains a little bit about this Jupiter dasha in that video. At Jupiter o'clock in the soul, we enter a phase focused on joyfully fulfilling one's duties. This is child rearing for most people. Jupiter has a lot to do with children. This has to do, it's a phase of mental maturity. You're done with the Venus, you're done with the excitement. You start to take on responsibilities that enforce a determination, or at least you begin to crave taking on responsibilities that mature the mind, that take a mature mind. I'm not a kid anymore. I want to do something that's really meaningful and fulfilling to me, and I want to move in that direction. Jupiter is an explorative phase. It's not the same as the sun, which is the sort of the flower of this purpose in life. At the Jupiter period, from 32 onwards, our physical vigor begins to decline. Venus is the period of our highest physical vigor. And then in Jupiter, our physical vigor begins to decline. As I call it, the baby rabies of women begins to fade, and although it's mostly in our late 30s, especially that women begin to truly fade in their desire and capacity for their egg to develop into an embryo, and a healthy embryo, and a child. So the Jupiter period is especially important for women, because it's a big period of change for women. Especially once we all get into our 40s. We're going to explain how that's an intense period for everybody. But ultimately, the Jupiter period is about contentment over excitement. It's also about experiencing what true love means. And again, I recommend you checking out my video on Jupiter is true love. But to crack down to it, Jupiter's more about the what of love instead of the how of love. You know, Venus is about having an enjoyable exchange with a partner. Jupiter is about what we do with it. What are we doing with our shared lives together? What are we building on? Are we building on children? You know, if a priest is living with a nun, whenever that nun fluffs the priest's pillows, makes him his coffee, he goes, she's fluffing God's pillows. And she's making God's coffee because that priest goes and does the work of God. So just by living with that man who has a shared Jupiter connection with her, her Jupiter is fulfilled just by serving that man. It's the same thing when the priest comes home and does something for his wife. He knows that by doing that for his wife, his wife is a nun. She's doing the work of God too. So they have a shared purpose, and by living together, they're serving themselves. And they give each other the space for individual bliss, contentment, and happiness. And even if they're not lovey-dovey, ooey-gooey, kissy, that's Venus stuff. You know, true love and marriages last not because of Venus ooey-gooey kissiness, but because of shared purpose. And this is what we learn in the Jupiter period from 32 to 50, especially when we get into our 40s. If you've got a good Jupiter in your chart with no afflictions, you're going to intuit the importance of this period, and you're going to find satisfaction and consistency in your effort. If you've got a bad or afflicted Jupiter during this period, you're going to find extreme excitement and then extreme depression in turns. You'll get frustration and not being fulfilled in your purpose. Generally. You know, I could do a video, I think I'm going to eventually do a video on this subject. Next is the Sun o'clock in the soul. It's the Sun Naisargika Dasha. And what it's actually called the second half of life. It's the middle age. So at this point we have the realization of true greatness. Why do I feel like I'm missing a slide here? I'm just going to do a quick peek at something. Yeah, okay, whatever. No, I was intuiting something, but that's okay. In the Sun period, we are in the second half of life, from 50 onwards. This is what is called middle age. At this period, we experience the realization of true greatness within ourselves. Greatness, success, and accomplishment. The cream of life's goals and purpose occurs at this time. This relates to legacy. This relates to our kingdom. So what have we created? What favor have we garnered from the government, from our pension, from our family, from our corporations that we've been working for? And what great work have we done with all these regards? You know, this is usually the age where most people are no longer dealing with rearing children. So now the kids have typically grown up around by this time, or at least they're getting to be grown up, to the point where the kids can take care of themselves, and now the parents have to ask, now what do we do? Now what do I do? What has been my purpose? You know, the childbearing dharma of a householder is takes up a lot of energy, takes up a lot of karma, takes up a lot of data in your RAM of your soul. So now your RAM is not being taken up by having kids. So now what are you going to do with it? So this old fella here is looking a little bit more decrepit, I think, than necessary for this age. You know, but it's late 60s that we tend to start to really, again, decline in our physical age. But now, from 50 onwards, you can do a duty that's born of your innate nature. And you will do so if you've done so all your life. And that's usually if the sun is well placed. Now, if the sun is afflicted in the chart, if you've got the sun debilitated in Libra, or if it's in, you know, Taurus or Libra, if the sun is in Taurus or Libra, it's starved by Venus, it's likely that the excitement phase of Venus of trying to, you know, live for the pleasure has probably at some levels sapped the continuum of your dedication to the sun, right? So we can kind of see again that we build these things as we go. In the sun period, someone with a good sun, with no affliction, if it's exalted, close to the 10th house, if it's got delight from its friends, then their innate nature, they have been purposefully working at it their whole lives. So when they get to be 50, now it's warmed up. You know, the planetary dashas are woven into the fabric of every moment. Even when we're young, the sun has its hand in the present moment. So if you break your leg in your 30s, that'll obstruct your capacity to be an Olympic runner in your 50s if you choose to do that once your kids are all gone to college or whatever. If you neglected your health, your debt, your responsibilities to your company, etc., these obstructions to end life content were woven as you went along in your life. This is especially true, of course, of the final period, Saturn, from 70 to 120 onwards. Saturn o'clock in the soul. Old age, pensions, wills, legacy, and of course the theme of being taken care of. I'm lucky that I have two parents who were born with pretty good Saturns. They both got Saturn in Capricorn. So my parents have earnestly worked hard so that they can have pensions, so that they can take care of themselves. And now I don't really have to worry about my mom and dad too much, at least financially. When they get old enough that someone's got to take care of them, me and my brother and my sister are going to take care of them because they've done a lot for us. You know, that's part of their Saturn. It's like we owe it to them, but we want to do it anyway, but just because they've done so much for us in our lives. That's, you know, so they have Saturns that signify in some ways that someone's going to take care of them. And they've been taking care of that thought throughout their whole lives. You know? Remember, again, that the dashas flower in terms of their effects coming through our planets in the chart. The sign, the house, the yogas, etc. So whatever houses that Saturn rules in your chart are going to become prominent at 70 onwards, as well as the planets that are in Capricorn and Aquarius, and the house, the sign, the aspects, the yogas, etc., related to Saturn. So this is the age where our last great accomplishments should be completed. The body rapidly decays from 70 onward. And in particular, it's important to say that in the Saturn period, there is a concentration on spiritual and psychic affairs, which should take over the material affairs. Ideally, there's going to be an extreme inward sensitivity, almost like a baby that's vulnerable, very open. But, you know, babies and old people are both closer to the yawning chasm of death than anyone who has vitality and is living a material life in the middle. So older folks, 70 and onward, are like children in the sensitivity and psychic sensitivity, but they are also, in a way, there's a detrimentality there because there's less energy in an old person. Less energy to deflect, less innocence. They're very aware. And there can be a fearfulness, especially, again, if somebody has a weak Saturn in their chart, then there could be a lot of fearfulness, a lot of nightmarish internal mental anguish that can come from somebody who's got a very afflicted Saturn in their chart who reaches the age of 70. Now, ultimately, this is for a reason. This goes to show how Saturn truly is a planet of greatness in some ways. If a person has their material affairs well taken care of, and if they've been having their material affairs well taken care of, in old age, as the bones set in, as the body falls away, there can be a great bliss that comes in the Saturn period. And it's partly due to the psychic sensitivity, this spirituality, that now I can finally drop the material world and focus within on the real deepest spiritual crux of what life is. Usually, such people have been like someone with a good Saturn, making sure all of their bookends are tucked in. They've completed their tail ends of all their karmas. They've said their goodbyes and their pieces to the people who have left them or the people who are leaving them, the friends or enemies that they've always wanted to say this thing to. This is a time where people are doing all these things, getting them out of the way so they can clean their plate in order to have a blissful time entering back into the psychic unknown, returning back to the eternal center with a clean plate so that they have no internal will or angst with which to resist God's assignment of what they're doing the next time around. So true greatness is experienced in charts with good Saturn. This is a time of being so happy that you did the right thing in your life if you've got a good Saturn. If you've got an afflicted Saturn or afflictions in Capricorn and Aquarius, it's likely that there will be a miserly bitterness, a feeling that you're just a number. Too distracted also. The person will be too distracted by crippling fears or physical ailments in the body to focus on the enjoyment of what they've accomplished. It's like almost no matter what they did, it can never be enough kind of thing. So it shows the importance of Saturn, its humbleness. The feeling that you don't need to necessarily do something great. You just needed to do what was right for your soul. Right? Beautiful. I love talking about Saturn. There's so many lessons there. Now, on top of this, interwoven into Saturn's transits, interwoven into Naisargika Dasha, are the maturation ages of the planets and the nodes. Graha maturity also flowers through the positions of the planets in a chart. The expected fruit of a planet's position will emerge while the person's childish inclinations towards that planet decline. The person really comes into how this planet is supposed to operate at the time of its maturation. Now, truly, let me just see if you guys can see me here. Truly, the sun is an important period, an important maturation. Really, they're all important, but it's not until Mars matures at 28 that these maturities happen to happen at like neck-breaking points, like real neck-turn points in the life. 28 is also when the Saturn return occurs, and there's also a nodal shift at that time, I believe. Same thing with 32, same thing with 36. 36, 43, and 48 are the big ones. Even 28 is big too. These are key years that we're going to see in the larger chart where many things are falling in at the same time. 28, 36, 43, and 48. Particularly 36, 43, and 48, there's a very important maturation process. Now, I couldn't really find, there's not much with regards to the reading that I've done, which I can point to a scriptural text regarding these maturations, but like ancient jyotish authors, usually what that means is that either the thing is, a cultural stipulation that might not have real deep roots, or it's so systemic to jyotish that it's written by various authors and no single author claims it. And this is one of those things. The maturations of the grahas are very well known all throughout jyotish. Everyone knows about them. So it's one of those ubiquitous, important aspects of jyotish and the evolutionary script. So a planet becomes mature and loses its childlike inclinations during the year of its maturation. And again, most of these are subtle up to the age of 28. Mars is significant, where undue aggression subsides, and this correlates with the first Saturn return. The person loses a lot of the aggression of being a 20-year-old, when Mars matures, and you can almost see it in the person. There's a lightness that gets applied to them. Even more lightness comes at 32 when Mercury matures and the person stops being stupid with their money, comparatively speaking. This brings financial and energetic savvy towards debt and one's energetic investments. We start thinking maturely, and of course this, at 32, Mercury matures. This correlates also with the Jupiter period coming on. There's, again, a seriousness. Like, I want to use my money in order to further the interests that actually mean something to me. That's what happens at 32. At 36, Saturn matures, and this is another very key age. Some important lessons occur regarding healthy limits, using resources, and help wisely at this time. It comes down to paying off debt, completing karma. The houses that Saturn rules become unlocked. That's the houses that Capricorn and Aquarius rule, depending on the rising sign. Saturn's natal house and sign, and its aspect, and its yogas, this becomes sort of unlocked at the age of 36, where it becomes fully into play. And we effectively become an adult at 36 years old. Of course, there's also a nodal return, the second nodal return that happens at this time, as well as I believe our third Jupiter return. And there's usually around 35 up to the point of 36. We usually get slammed with karma, whether it's debt, some kind of pressure gets put on us at 36, around 35. And it's up to 36 when, through the pressure that karma comes to us at this time, we learn what is pressure worth taking on and what is needless pressure that is not serving me. Because a lot of the times we take on pressure, we take on things, we say yes to things that don't actually further our spirit and soul in person, right? So this happens all the time. You got to learn your nose in order to make good use of Saturn. And I don't mean your olfactory nose. I mean your nose. Learn to say no. It's a very important thing when it comes to Saturn, right? And of course, the Rahu and Ketu maturation are very, very, very key dimensions of every reading in some ways, especially if I'm going to be, if I'm counseling someone 36 or older, I'm going to mention that they're made it to 36 and there's an important period happening. And then I'm going to tell them you got big fish to fry coming in your 40s. The midlife crisis period that everybody knows and hears about. There's a lot of things that happen in your 40s that completely shift, chuck the game. Completely sideways, completely rewind, rewire who you are, who you thought you were, who you wanted to be. Karma comes as well as internal realizations that force inner movement come as well. So our Rahu maturation is the first to occur in terms of, in terms of these maturations. We have Rahu maturing at 43, and we have Ketu maturing at 48. The Rahu maturation is a very key time. It really unlocks and unfolds this midlife crisis theme of your 40s. And in my neo-Vedic opinion, the maturation of the nodes has a lot more to do with your midlife crisis than Uranus, the Uranus opposition does. Although the two do occur simultaneously and they do stack. But Rahu is simply more of a load-bearing wall in everyone's evolutionary process than Uranus is. That comes from evolutionary astrology as well as jyotish, although jyotish doesn't talk about Uranus. But even in evolutionary astrology of Jeffrey Wolf Green, the nodes are considered more of an evolutionary backbone than anything at some level, bar Pluto. Pluto is very important to Jeffrey Wolf Green. I digress. Now, you'll often hear me say when I'm doing my cold readings, or if you've done a reading with me, that in a lot of ways, Rahu and Ketu are the heart of evolutionary soul astrology. Let that sink in. I did a great video with Timothy Halloran of Rasa Leela Healing on the subject of the nodes, and I recommend that video. I recommend his channel in general. He's a beautiful soul and smart dude. And he does a lot of work with the nodes, because the nodes are, as he often describes it, through his training with evolutionary astrology, the nodes of the moon especially represent an aspect of our feeling, and it's our feelings that are the energy that we experience on this planet. That's why the moon is so important. The sun is this eternal thing. It's the same old soul it's always been. But the moon's movements are what we actually experience. And they are the sliver, the crescent of meaning for what karma means in this moment, in relation to eternity. But we can't relate to eternity except through what we're feeling right now. This is why the moon and the nodes are the most important data to look at in astrology. Take it from me, take it however you want to hear it, but put that one in your hat and digest it. Now, like I said, I'm going to do more about these nodal transits and the maturation of the nodes in a separate video. But to really squeeze it together, Ketu is really the root, the emotional root, the soul root. It's the subliminal emotional fortress that we're born into through past lives. And we think we've mastered it. We think that we've gotten so much of this thing when we were young and in our past lives that we're so close to it that it's smoky and misty. So we evolve Ketu through this life, brings us through the opposite wisdom and lessons of Rahu, to peel back the psychic attachment we have to the false ideal of what Ketu is. Essentially, with Ketu, it's such a basic part of our emotional security paradigm that we need whatever's happening with Ketu, wherever Ketu's lord is, whatever sign, whatever planets it's touching, whatever house it's in. These things all represent a deeply key emotional security paradigm that we need to figure out first in order for us to have the energy to live effectively. If we don't have things related to Ketu in our sign and house, we're not really going to be able to operate at our most functional. I'm here, you guys see me doing this YouTube video. I got Ketu and Cancer. If my whole family died and everyone I loved died right now, I would not be here happy, smiling, being able to put in energy into doing this thing. So I need that Ketu and Cancer energy in order to survive. So let's see what happens in my 40s when things change. I'm only 32 at the time of this video. I digress. We often will surround ourselves with the illusion or with the feeling of what we need from that security of Ketu. But we are like, Ernst Wilhelm describes it as like you're in this fortress and you're trying to keep your fortress, you're trying to rule your fortress with kind of like an iron fist to keep everything tight and functional. And just over the hill, just over yonder, there could be gold in them hills. But we never go and see it because we're trying so hard to operate on the way we're used to operating our fortress. Rahu comes into our lives and forces us through curiosity. We're going to talk about Apu, the little monkey in Aladdin, who goes and tries to grab the ruby from Jafar's cave, and he's just risking his life. He needs to get the ruby. That's Rahu. Rahu is going to occasionally come into our lives, especially at the nodal returns, at 18 years old, at 36 years old, at 54 years old. Yeah. and but especially during the Rahu maturation. And Rahu completes Ketu. We think we've mastered Ketu, and that's why Ketu, its sign, its house, the planets associated with it, and its lord. Things related to Ketu are the one central piece of furniture we never think to look under in our emotional healing journey, although it may be central in our lives. It's very central to us. The Rahu maturation at 43 years old forces us through fate and a midlife crisis-like urgency to explore who we have never allowed ourselves to be, to explore who we really are now that we feel death's cold, hollow breath beaming on us from the other side of time. We've been pretending we are secure where Ketu is in order to survive well enough, to do it enough to let us get by and live our material lives. But now Rahu maturation comes in, and what happens, it's like Apu, if you've ever seen the Aladdin movie, the little tiny monkey guy. He is with Aladdin, and they go into this cave, and there's a red ruby at the center of this cave, and he wants to go and grab it so bad, and Aladdin says, no, I don't think this is a good idea. But Apu's like, oh, but the ruby, I need it, I want to grab it. And he grabs it, and then all of a sudden all hell breaks loose inside of this cave, and it's like, oh, whoops. But the monkey risks it all to get that Rahu, to get that thing that it's never gotten, and to embody Rahu. We must release our Ketu illusions that we've built up in order to do so. It is King surrendering our... I don't know what I've written in my notes here. Fortunately, sometimes my writing's a little weird, but it's surrendering our false security and comfort. Risking and surrendering our false security and comfort in this paradigm that this imaginary paradigm that we've built over Ketu. We have to let it go in order to feel what Ketu really means to us. And this happens in our 40s. This leads to Ketu and its raw, painful truth and healthy limitations emerging. Ketu is a narrow gate, and we fight it. We resist thinking that we have a soul that has a specific fate for us. And then Ketu comes in and says, surprise, the soul has form. So that is the nature of the nodes maturing. And those maturations are an extremely important time. And this is one of the huge key aspects of the 40-year-old life cycle. Now, of course, the evolutionary nodes cycling in their transits is also this will be the fourth evolutionary arc. And this is something that I'm going to be discussing a little bit more in another video. But essentially, we see the nodes go in reverse from the natal point. And wherever the north node is, that shows a significant point where we desire to move forward in. Of course, the transiting north node, when the sun and moon have a new moon at that point, let's say at the time of this video, the north node is in Aries. So in April, there's a new moon in the sign of Aries. The sun was in Aries, and the moon came to Aries, and they were a few degrees away from the transiting north node. That was an eclipse. So this is why eclipses happen. There's a lot of astronomy to describe what goes on there. But the eclipses occur basically, there's technically 4 eclipses a year, 2 solar eclipses and 2 lunar eclipses, and sometimes that number even jags around a little bit. The north node eclipses are signifying forward movement of evolutionary energy that we need to focus on for that whole year, but especially during the times of the eclipses. And of course, the natal node, the lunar nodes in transit are moving backwards about a year and a bit usually, Every 4.5 years, there's a square, and then every 9 or so years, there's an opposition. Another 4.5 years is another square, another 4.5. So it's about 18 and change years before the natal north node comes to return to its natal point. Now these quadrants represent where the north node eclipses are occurring from our natal north node. And it's our natal north node that is the pin to what creates these quadrants. So when we're born with the natal north node here. Then 4.5 years later, we have a square, and then we come into quadrant B. And this is, each of these quadrants means something slightly different. And we have to say at this point that any natal planets in each quadrant, as the transiting north node moves into it, each planet will have karma associated with that leg of the journey. And this will show up especially during the entire period of a transiting north or south node eclipse visiting that quadrant. In this example, we have planets in quadrant A, which are technically behind the north node. But the north node in this chart here, we would see the north node would go from its natal point and move ahead. So if there would have been eclipses, a year after this point, there would have been a north node eclipse on the natal moon and Venus. Another year or so later, the north node eclipse would have happened on Saturn. And the whole time that the north node's in this quadrant A, these planets are going to be affected, and there's karma that they're going to have to deal with at this time. It's almost like dealing with a Saturn transit, right? So quadrant A is where we always begin. The north node eclipses are occurring in the realm of Rahu for quadrant D and A, right? Now again, I'm going to do another video on this, so I don't want to spend too much time on it, but you can see quadrant A, we're going away from Rahu, the peak of Rahu, and leading towards quadrant B. When you get into quadrant B, after the natal square, then quadrant B, you're moving into Ketu land. And the north node eclipses year by year are going to stomp around in the area of our natal Ketu. And then we're dealing with roots. We're dealing with roots at that point, right? We're dealing with B. It's a tension point where we're really digging into Ketu. And then C is where we've been doing a lot of the Ketu things. We're finally preparing to go back into Rahu land, right? And then finally, we're back in Rahu land in quadrant D, where we're coming just behind our natal Rahu point. And it's at that point when we're in quadrant D, we reach the peak of the natal north node, and that's another north node return. It's a peak of Rahu energy at that point. And that's usually sort of like a square in itself, where there's usually a feeling of a life shift at that point. So this is our evolutionary calendar put all together. Of course, there's very much to look at here. Again, you guys can pause. You can go to the beginning of this video. That's why I did it at the beginning. You can pause the video and look at the calendar and see where you are in the calendar, and where are you in life? Which of these big moments are coming up for you is the question, right? I'm 32 at the time of this video, so I'm going through this little chunk, and I'm going to have 36 happening in the next 4 years. So we can see the very beginning period, it's mostly taken up by what we call Ernst Wilhelm's early childhood planets. There's still natal Saturn, there's still Saturn squares that happen, there's node squares that happen, but these three planets in their periods are the main picture at this point. Our evolution, our childhood development period. Then from 12 on, the Venus period starts, and we're starting to become an adult for whom karma means something, right? At 14 years, there's our Saturn opposition. 16, Saturn matures. Now, as we can see, I've plotted out what are the most important points in this series. 18 to 22, 27 years old, where there's 3 different things going on. At 32 years old, at 36 years old, 43, 48. Around 54 and 57, we have our Saturn return. And even 57 has another nodal square going on there. And then there's the Great Cycle period. At 70 years old, we have another Saturn opposition, our fourth nodal return, and our sixth Jupiter return. And that all squishes into one place. So at this point, I got to check my time. Yeah, that's okay. It is what it is. I knew that this would be a long video, but I'm squashing a lot into this video, and I'm happy about that. So let's just have our last look at what these points in the script mean. And this is just a little view of what it's all looking at. So the first significant point is going to come 18 to 22. We have our first nodal return at 18. It's the first time where, you know, we're kind of coming out of high school and we've been in the fortress for a long time. Now we're busting through the gates. Usually this is a college period for people. A lot of changes tend to take place around here. So it's our first node return, and there's a peak of Rahu energy at this point where we want to go and see what kind of gold is over there in them hills, but we're still very immature at this time. 22, the sun matures. Then, of course, we have Venus and the moon maturing, and that'll be especially important for people with moon and Venus energy in their chart. 28 is an important age where Mars matures. A nodal opposition occurs, and we experience our Saturn return for the first time, right? So the nodal opposition means we're coming into quadrant C, of course, and that's coming out of the K2 phase of the nodes. And after position C, we move into nodal square D, which is really Rahu land at the age of 32. But we're still dealing with a lot of karma at the same time as our Saturn return at 28 years old, right? Because again, when the North Node is in quadrant C, we're getting the last of the K2 energy all tied up and the loose ends figured out. At the same time as the Saturn return. So of course, everyone knows 28 is always a shit show. Many musicians and artists have died around age 28. Because they got famous and they sort of went buck wild with their money, with drugs, whatever. And this time period often kills a lot of people, you know. So if you've made it past 28, you're doing okay. Age 32 is when we enter the paradigm-altering period of Jupiter. Mercury also matures and we experience another nodal square. During this nodal square, we enter quadrant D, where we have entered another Rahu period. It's the beginning of the Rahu period, which is antsy. It's you know, you haven't gone out into the forest for a long time since you were 18, basically, or 14 or whatever. So now you're 32, you're past the Saturn return, you're in the Jupiter period, and things are all starting to narrow and mature. What do I really want to do with my life? What do I really want to do with my energy? What's a waste of time and what's not? Now, 36, some say, is the most important moment in our lives. It's a real make or break moment. Saturn the Great matures. We focus our dedicated efforts to self-conquest and maturity. Saturn enters a natal square at this time. Our third Jupiter return occurs, and K2 comes online through the second nodal return, signaling what's going to happen in our 40s, right? So at 36, we can see here, let's go here, right? From 32 to 36, we're in quadrant D. Then at 36 years old, we have our second North Node return. There's going to be transits, and there's going to be eclipses, rather, on the place where our North Node is. So the North Node eclipses are bringing out karma of our own natal Rahu. And this is when Saturn matures. This is when Saturn is also at a natal square. And our third Jupiter return happens here. Because Jupiter, you know, it goes at every 12 years. It makes a new cycle. So there's a real breath of fresh air and a real reorientation of who we are and what we're doing at age 36. Now, this brings us into the 40s. From 42 to 45, there's a lot of midlife crisis themes that emerge. And I should say, I'm going to backpedal a little bit here. At 36, with this, they say that K2 comes online after your second nodal return. And this is when, remember, I've talked about how K2 is like the crux of evolutionary meaning in the soul, in the whole chart. At 36, on your second nodal return, K2 begins to stir inside the Kundalini, inside of fate, inside of the genetic material of your genes, of your DNA, of your brain. So K2 begins to operate, begins to come through. And it's what K2's desire to unbuckle itself from its illusions that causes this energy to fully fall through and to fully open up and to essentially attract midlife crisis energy. And this is what happens for those first 4 years as we plunge into the age of 42 to 45 especially. The Uranus opposition is underway around this point usually. Saturn has its second opposition at 42, which means Saturn is going to be opposite where it was natally since your last Saturn return. And of course, this means that Saturn is very much far away from its own comfort zone, its own natal point. So there's important karma that happens at that point. And if you can remember around what happened to you at around age 14, that'll help you ponder what that means for you. Now at age 43, the all-important Rahu maturation causes inner transformation via action. It attracts transformation. And there's also another nodal opposition at 45, right? So we've been in quadrant B. Let's see here. So there's at 36, there's our second nodal return. And then we go through quadrant A, and then at age 40, we have the nodal square that brings us into B. And then at 45, just after the Rahu maturation, we have a peak K2 square. And we're going into the north node is entering quadrant C. It's going to be north node eclipses in quadrant C here. And that is going to build up to quadrant D, entering another Rahu phase. And it's this quadrant C from 45 till about 49 that really finishes and builds on the energy of the K2 maturation. So the nodal opposition at 45 is sort of the eye of the hurricane, where K2 really begins to emerge in its fullness and maturity. But in order to do so, this is this period where the baby rabies are done, and there's a crisis of what's the meaning of my life that happens at this period. K2 matures at 48, and here, around 48 to 50, whatever changes could be expected from the evolutionary nodes are sort of set in stone after about 48 to 50. Whatever transpired in your late 40s likely took so much energy that there's no more desire to transform further. At 49, there's a third Saturn square, adds some finalizing tension. And around this time at 49 also, the north node is posited in quadrant D, which completes K2's work in this cycle after maturing. K2 has been dealing with it all. Now at 49 years old, it sort of dives into quadrant D. At 50, this is the next sun period, and this is that very important Rahu energy that builds through at this point. So 50 is where this sun period begins. A true new leaf, the true middle point in life, where one's destiny should not only be coming into view, but within one's grasp. Now remember that the sun is a malefic, so it's not necessarily to say that this will be easy. But if you've lived by your inherent nature throughout your whole life, and if your sun is unafflicted, this should be a satisfying and worthwhile challenge. You know, if I ever do a video on the Sun Naisargika Dasha, you'll know and you'll have a better chance of understanding what affliction to the Sun means. And, you know, regardless, 50 is this new period where, especially at 50, we know we've just come into the North Node eclipses moving towards we're in Rahu land again at this point, right? At 54, there's a peak that happens from our third nodal return. Now, this is our first nodal return since the nodes have matured and the Sun period is on at this point. So during the Sun period, remember, it is this consolidation of like, it's the cream of the life after 50. What did it all mean? What did all that build up to? The kids are gone to college. You know, now I can actually do what my spirit, my soul, my inherent nature bids that I do to my fullest and best that I can. So my life has some meaning and purpose through this energy of my soul, my true accomplishments. So at 54, we're in the Sun period. This peak Rahu energy is 54 is a huge one, a very important peak period of soul expression. At 57, we have our second Saturn return. And similarly, this Saturn return should be karma completing effort because the nodes have matured and you're in the Sun period. What goals and accomplishments have been left undone? Accomplishments, legacy, and the pressures of time emerge all at once to sculpt the diamond of your final real hurrah at what you're doing here on planet Earth. But don't worry, you still got lots of time before you're 70 years old. At 59, the node square shifts energy into quadrant B. So at 59, we're shifting back out of Rahu land. You know, from 54 to 59, we're finishing some real Rahu energy, getting the most out of what we want to explore and what we can do. But after 59, we're coming into our 60s. The energy for the next 9 years is basically aimed at another K2 period. We're in K2 land. The North Node has eclipses transiting through the K2 side of the chart. So an emphasis is pointed at K2 and roots. Now it's 63 and 65. 63, there's a nodal opposition. And this represents the first time we've peaked in K2 land since K2 first matured at 48 years old. So this is 63. The North Node reaches a peak of K2 energy. And at this point, we obviously, you know, a lot of people retire at this age. Their pension ideally would kick in, and they're getting the last bit of gas out, especially related to K2 things at this time. Saturn is also going through its first square since the most recent Saturn return. That's 65 years old. So there's a real chink of energy there, 63 to 65, when people usually officially retire, at least here in Canada. Now at 67, there's an important nodal square, the North Node moving towards Rahu now. At 67, now we're in quadrant D. Now we're in the final Rahu land. And this is very interesting. It's the last hurrah before old age kicks in. You're getting your affairs in order to fully enjoy retiring. And it peaks at a very interesting time. This is our final slide here. At 70, the Saturn period begins. Your body officially declines to its natural old age stature. At 71 years old, around 71, 72, 73, you have a Saturn opposition. And this is highly emphasized due to the Saturn period. Saturn is, again, very far from its natal position. It's in a tough spot. It's the furthest from its natural, comfortable position. And this invites hard karma. Now, since you're in the Saturn period, where everything related to Saturn, including its transits, is emphasized, many people kick the bucket at this time. And this is a very important time for dealing with being stable in this type of karma. Now, thankfully, at 72, Jupiter's sixth return comes to bring in some much-needed luck. Now, again, I would say at 71 for this Saturn opposition, I would remind you that you had another Saturn opposition at 42. So think about being 14 and 42 to get a little bit of a perspective on what this opposition means for you at that time, because there will be repeating motifs. Now at 72, Jupiter comes in to give him some much needed luck on his Jupiter return. Ideally, if you don't have too afflicted Jupiter. If you have a terrible Jupiter, then this Jupiter's return might just bring more karma. The fourth nodal return at this point. You have the North Node has eclipses occurring in your natal North Node. And this signifies a great emphasis of Rahu at this time. Now, to be honest, what I've put here, and it is true, is that this is kind of beyond me, the implications of this. You've come just into your Saturn period, and because I'm young, I can't really say what happens here. But I speculate some profound spiritual significance to Rahu, your North Node position, occurs here. Hey, Pops, I'm going to be done in about 5.
Okay.
Thanks, buddy. Thanks for your patience. Me and my Pops are going to have to see a show, and I'm making him late. But that's okay. He's patient with me. So as a young man, I can only say so much of what happens at this period. But some significant, profound spiritual significance to Rahu occurs here, because one's typical living is not there to distract the person from soul matters. Now we're at the peak of Rahu, at a time when Saturn has taken the reins of what's going on in your life. So you're not distracted by typical living. So this is especially if Saturn is well placed. If Saturn is afflicted, if you're getting rocked by the Saturn period, if there's a lot of things, if you don't have people to take care of you, you don't have money, you're homeless, it's going to be a lot harder for you to deal with the depth of the soul, to make peace with your internal vistas of meaning and purpose in life, if you are living homeless, like many, many old people do at this point, who have neglected to be a part of our capitalistic, patriarchal, Capricornish system of hierarchy and dominance. It's a very sad thing. So Saturn is our friend, ladies and gentlemen, and if you have a good Saturn at this time, then you will have things letting them slide so you can look within at this very critical key juncture at the age of 72. Now I gotta go, folks. Thanks for watching. If you feel so inclined, you can donate to my channel here through the PayPal link available in the description box of this video, or you can just go paypal.me/DustinCormier91. I had a really good time doing this video. It's a real jam-packed article. So I'm glad I got to do this for everybody. I'm Dustin Cormier. This is How to Rock Astrology. Keep your eyes on the skies. I'm glad that I got to talk about this video, and keep your eyes peeled, because I'm going to have more stuff related to everything that I've talked about here coming out on my channel as time goes on. Let me know in the comments what you thought. Feel free to discuss, ask me any questions. There's a lot to unfold here. This has been the beginning of this unfolding knowledge that I'm happy to share on my channel. Take care, folks. Thanks for watching.